Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining and thank you for your interest in Farmer's Edge and our Smart Carbon program. This afternoon, we're going to talk about one of the hottest topics in ag right now, and that's carbon. There's a lot of popular press on the role that ag can play in climate and greenhouse gas and particularly carbon. And so what I'd like to do is really set the stage by defining really what carbon offsets are and discussing what are the types of carbon markets that exist today and what might exist moving forward. And we'll talk a little bit about what are those practices that qualify, what is climate smart farming. I'll introduce our Smart Carbon program and really what we're doing in the 2021 growing season, forecast a little bit of where this is going longer term, really walk through from end to end, how do you generate these high quality agricultural offsets? What does that emission life cycle look like from enrolling into the project to really the sale of those first carbon offsets? We'll look at a case study that really will start to frame up what this could mean for your farm and your operation. And then, we've got a special offer for your farm for the 2021 season. First I want to talk about really this digital agricultural ecosystem and the data and the insight and the decision making that the Farm Command platform can really drive for an operation in partnership with your trusted advisors, your retailers, your partners. And it all centers really around the connected farm and being able to make decisions across the major categories of decisions that drive your operation. And historically, we think about data or digital agronomy or digital agriculture as it relates to seed, fertilizer, crop protection, agronomic decisions, maybe collecting equipment data, managing irrigation. But as we look into the future, this data becomes a really powerful decision-making tool for other things like grain marketing, financial decisions, risk management, traceability of the products coming off of the farm, and certainly carbon. As we look at the emerging carbon market, one thing is for certain that the amount of data required to generate a high quality agricultural offset is not going to change. And so I think there's a real benefit from leveraging an integrated digital platform that helps with those agronomic decisions, but as a side benefit really can help you engage in this carbon market. So what is a carbon offset? So it's a digital environmental asset that represents the reduction of 1 metric ton of CO2 equivalent or carbon dioxide equivalent. This is a global standard measurement of greenhouse gas. And so every ton of emissions that are removed and put and stored in the soil or reduced through better fertilizer management, better fuel efficiency equals 1 carbon offset. The market and what's driving this demand around carbon offsets is really the number of companies and governments that need to meet either a regulated emissions target or a voluntary emissions target. So there's been a lot of conversation around cap and trade or regulated market, and really some of these large final emitters that are using a lot of energy to reduce their footprint. And then on the other side of that balance, you essentially have these carbon projects that are the sources of accredited carbon offsets. So things that can be used to get these companies closer to their net zero targets or objectives. If you think about how offsetting really works, take, for example, a company that has 12 tons of emissions. This is just through their normal business processes. Could be through a manufacturing process, could be through their energy and electricity, natural gas usage, could be from their travel. One of the ways that they can get to net zero is they can change the way that they're operating their business. They can source their raw materials differently. They can become more energy efficient. They can introduce different sources of electricity. But those are things, from a reduction standpoint that they can control in their operations. Some companies may be able to get to close to net zero, depending on the type of business that they're doing with those internal reductions. But in many cases, even with those efficiency improvements, those companies will need to offset some of the remaining footprint. And the way that they do that is they purchase these accredited offsets from a market to essentially get to that zero carbon footprint. There's essentially two types of carbon markets. There's a regulatory market, which would be your cap and trade or legislated market that is putting a requirement around being net zero or close to net zero. Alberta, as an example of this, has been operating a regulated market for the last several years, and California also has a regulated ag offset market. The faster emerging market right now is this voluntary market, where companies are purchasing offsets as part of their environmental, social, and governance reporting commitments that they've made to their shareholders and their owners to operate at net zero to the environment. And there's been a lot of large companies that have made these public commitments around getting to net zero, maybe by 2030, 2040, 2050, depending on the type of business that they're in. And so we see a tremendous demand as these companies do a greenhouse gas inventory of their business and start to understand where they can make improvements in their operations, but are also realizing that there's going to be a need to offset the remaining emissions through the purchase of offsets. Now, the current market price in the voluntary market is somewhere between $20 and $40 a ton. And so this is a pretty strong number. We expect that to continue to grow over time. Has seen significant growth in the last 12 to 18 months. And as we continue to see the federal governments, the provincial governments try to understand what they're going to do from a regulatory perspective, we expect these voluntary markets to continue to grow. I would expect that we won't have one or the other. We won't have an all regulated market or an all voluntary market. I would expect that we'll have some combination of the two. There's essentially two major ag greenhouse gases when you talk about carbon and offsets in agriculture. There's carbon dioxide, which is the primary greenhouse gas, and there's nitrous oxide, which is a more potent ag greenhouse gas being driven by use of nitrogen fertilizer. It's actually 6 times more potent than carbon dioxide in terms of a greenhouse gas effect. And it certainly is a focal point for a lot of the ag industry, not only as it relates to greenhouse gases, but also from a water quality perspective. So I would expect that as we continue in this carbon journey, that there'll continue to be incremental focus on that nitrous oxide component. The climate smart farming really is about a few practices, and many of you are maybe implementing some of these practices already on your farm, or maybe you're considering changing some of the operations on your farm. But the types of things that qualify for offsets, that can earn carbon offsets, is from a CO2 perspective, it really becomes about minimizing soil disturbance and sequestering carbon in the soil through the way that you choose your crop rotation, minimizing tillage, introducing things like cover crops, or a more varied crop rotation, crop mix, length of time that you have something green growing in the field and leaving it there undisturbed. The nitrous oxide component really is driven by 4R nitrogen practices, the right rate, the right source, the right timing, and the right placement. And so it's driven by things like placing fertilizer in a band in the ground versus surface application. Or if you're using in-crop surface applications, you're using an enhanced efficiency nitrogen fertilizer. Maybe it's slow release, maybe it's a coated urea, or you're using a nitrification inhibitor of some sort. So it's all of those elements around how are you managing nitrogen. Are you applying it all in the spring? Are you doing split applications? What's the source of nitrogen that you're using? And are you getting it in the ground versus on the surface to minimize those nitrous oxide emissions reductions? So we've introduced a program that we're calling Smart Carbon. And the objective of Smart Carbon is to align productivity with profitability to drive ecologically sound farm management. This is driven by the data set that the Farm Command platform and the connected farm deliver through the connectivity with the cab, the weather stations, the imagery, the crop planning assets, the job management, to be able to leverage this data set not only to inform better agronomic decisions or in-season decisions as situations change, but also to capture that data so that it can be leveraged to turn this into either high quality carbon offsets, or looking into the future, things like low carbon grain. If you can leverage this data to essentially prove the practices that have been occurring on the farm, you have a really good opportunity to create high quality carbon offsets. If you can also take that data set that you've used from a carbon offset perspective and start to layer additional pieces of information on top of that, like fuel usage, like energy usage in drying or aerating grain, you start to get a really good characterization of the footprint of that grain coming off of the field. And that data becomes really valuable for some of these large food, feed, and processing companies as they try to manage their footprints and really understand one of the ways that they can drive towards their goal of net zero is to buy the lowest carbon, lowest impact grain that they can source. And so I think that will continue to be an emerging topic as we move forward in the next couple of years. The Farm Command platform and Farmer's Edge, we do have experience in this space. So I mentioned the Alberta regulated market earlier. We have been operating in that regulated market through the Alberta emissions reduction registry in the last 6+ years. And so we are helping farmers generate carbon offsets, selling those carbon offsets and returning value to our customers. We've got a large team of carbon experts, including data scientists, agronomists, who have helped write some of these protocols and projects. If you think about a protocol, it's essentially the methodology that will be used to calculate that carbon offset. It's like a recipe in terms of what is the data necessary to be able to prove and to calculate these carbon offsets. This on-farm digital infrastructure becomes really important. The generation of a carbon offset can be a data-intensive process, but if you've got a good data platform, you've got a good decision support software platform that is collecting these pieces of data and organizing them in a single place, then you essentially have the necessary ingredients to create to complete that recipe. This digital platform that has these field-centric records, right? When did the crop get planted? When did a fertilizer or crop protection product get applied? When was it harvested? What was the yield? And having that in a consistent and organized format becomes really critical as you start to aggregate this across multiple fields and to do this for your entire operation. You know, the boots on the ground support that Farmers Edge offers ensures that the data is getting into the platform correctly, that it's organized, and that we're collecting that data through the season. And if there's gaps or we need to move data into the platform, that we've got somebody there to help with that. And if there's a conversation around what is the implication of this particular agronomic change or this agronomic recommendation, and how does it impact not only profitability, productivity, but how does it affect and what implication does it have on generating carbon offsets, either through soil sequestration or through nitrous oxide emissions reductions. And then of course the soil sampling infrastructure that we have at Farmers Edge to be able to not only take these samples, but to analyze these samples and get a really good characterization of the soil is a huge asset in this space, not only from a soil sequestration perspective, but also from a nitrous oxide emissions reduction. If you understand what's going on in the soil, you can gain confidence in, you know, different nitrogen management practices that may lead to a higher level of offsets. You know, our approach to climate smart farming is delivering these sustainable farming, water and land management practices to help capture more carbon in the soil. And this is really important to match not only the agronomic recommendations, but also to consider what the implication is from an environmental perspective, and how do we get credit for those things that we're doing from an agronomy standpoint. How do we create incremental value for those agronomic decisions that are climate smart? The second way is really how to leverage for our practices to optimize how the crop is fertilized, reduce nutrient losses, you know, lower nitrous oxide emissions, use nitrogen more effectively, justify the investment in new technology, really to drive not only crop productivity, but also profitability, potentially cost savings, as well as the benefit from an offset. Our Smart Carbon program is essentially focused on soil sequestration and carbon sequestration, in retaining that soil organic carbon. It rewards farms for following specific no-till parameters with a carbon offset per acre by increasing that carbon stored in the soil. So it really becomes about getting the carbon into the soil through crop growth, and then maintaining it there by reducing the disturbance of the soil. The requirement is really to collect evidence that the practices are followed. And this is where this integrated platform and connectivity of the equipment and an integrated solution around data starts to facilitate this process. So if you're passively collecting the information around operations in a field like planting or seeding or fertilizer application or tillage or application, you start to have all this evidence at your fingertips. And so we'll be running this soil carbon project in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and the BC Peace region in 2021. It is an annual project. And I think this is a really, really critical piece around soil carbon. It allows you to look back to 2018 and generate 3 years of historical carbon offsets, and then you can generate them annually moving forward. The thing that I really like about this project is if something happens from a mother nature, you have a weed infestation, you've got really wet soils, you need to do some sort of tillage to be able to bring the field back into productivity. There's an opportunity to do that. There's the flexibility to do that. While you may forego the offset for that year where the tillage occurred, there's an opportunity at moving forward if you go back to those no-till practices to continue to generate those offsets. From a nitrogen management perspective, this is really about nitrous oxide emissions reduction, and it rewards or generates offsets by instituting a 4R management plan following a set of prescribed best management practices. And again, this is about application timing, source, rate, and placement. And really there's a different categorization depending on how advanced you are in your nitrogen management on your farm. And so it may be that you've been considering some sort of change to your nitrogen management practices, and this might be the push that you need, or it may generate the incremental revenue that helps pay for that equipment to make the change. Now, the requirements really are around collecting evidence that the practice is followed. So again, this is where a product like Smart VR, where you're collecting that application information, you're executing a variable rate script. From a nitrogen perspective, you've got a 4R plan for the individual fields, and you're using the right source and placement of nitrogen really can provide incremental benefit. So we'll run this in the same geography as the soil carbon project, but we'll expand this to service Ontario as well. Again, this is an annual project, and it takes into account what happened in that particular growing season. It doesn't have as big of a look back period as the soil carbon project, but we will have the opportunity to look back to the 2020 season to generate those historical credits as well. In terms of, I always feel like an example really starts to bring this to life in terms of what does this really look like, or what could this look like on my operation. From a soil carbon perspective, we really divide the Western Prairies into two different geographies, the dry prairie area and the parkland area. And each of those have a different coefficient based on that soil type. In this example, if we assume that a farmer has 5,000 acres in each of those two areas, the rate of CO2 equivalent per acre per year in the dry prairie is about 0.06. and in the Parkland area, it's 0.11. And if you think about kind of the total CO2 equivalent that you can generate on that number of acres per year, and you're looking at 285 tons of CO2 equivalent per year in the dry prairie and 567 in the Parkland area. If you assume that carbon price per ton is $20, between the dry prairie farms and the parkland farms, you're going to generate roughly $17,000 on an annual basis from that soil carbon project. If you layer on the nitrogen management component as well, and we divide the nitrogen management project into a similar geography, but we divide it by the browns and dark brown soils, or the black and gray soils. And what I'm showing here is really the very basic element around nitrogen. There's 3 levels of best management practices: a basic, intermediate, and advanced nitrogen management, BMP. And so what I'm showing here is the very basic in terms of estimated yield of tons of CO2 equivalent per acre per year. And so they're relatively small because of that basic level at 0.04 and 0.07. But again, in those 10,000 acres, you're generating about $11,000 in revenue or value on an annual basis. Now, if you're practicing some of the more advanced nitrogen management practices, or BMPs, you're doing variable rate, you're using nitrification inhibitors or slow release urea, you're banding the fertilizer, where you may be qualifying for those advanced BMPs. You can expect that those rates might increase by 25 to 30%. So what does this look like in terms of the project life cycle as you enter into this? And really the first step is the assessment of existing farm management practices and making sure that you're choosing the right carbon strategy. Is it really soil carbon, or is it nitrous oxide, or is it a combination of the two? That is the benefit of being able to layer these two things together. And that's something that, Farmer's Edge can help you with on your operation, is really understanding what are those existing management practices, what changes could be made or what changes have been made recently, and what is the effect from a carbon offset perspective. And then it becomes about gathering those raw ingredients. So collecting and compiling the data, documentation as per the protocol and project guidelines, and make sure that the data meets the QA requirements. And so again, this is where our boots on the ground, our digital infrastructure, our integrated platform and experience can help guide you through this process and really understand, okay, here's the types of data that are required. Where do I have those pieces of data? Can we get those into the Farm Command platform so that moving forward, you're building on top of that base of data that you've generated? Thirdly is about the aggregation phase, and it's about aggregating across your entire operation, so aggregating across your individual fields, but also aggregating across all of the other project participants so that you can summarize these records for all of the participants. And what this aggregation phase allows Farmer's Edge to do is essentially take a large volume of potential offsets through the verification phase, which also allows a large volume to attract the best price for these voluntary offsets. So this third-party verification essentially is a third-party auditor that verifies the records that Farmers Edge has worked with you to collect and organize to ensure that the terms of the protocol and project are met. And so we'll do an initial calculation to understand what we believe is the appropriate number of offsets generated. We'll have organized the data essentially as the proof that those practices were followed and go through that independent verification. And that's something that we also have experience doing, and to be honest, would be quite difficult for an individual farmer to go through. Once you go through that verification phase, you essentially are serializing those offsets. And so you're essentially putting a serial number on each individual ton. And what that allows is the selling of those offsets and transferring ownership of those credits to the buyer. And once those credits are serialized and sold, those buyers retire and the registry retires those offsets, and those buyers can count those offsets towards their total emissions reductions and their net zero targets. Now, so how do we partner on this? How can Farmers Edge help you in this carbon journey? You know, the first thing obviously is digitizing the farm, making this data collection simple, easy, serve multiple different value propositions, and from agronomic decisions to operational decisions, and certainly from a carbon and sustainability perspective. As I mentioned, this can be a fairly data intensive process, and I think the Farm Command platform and utilization of that platform to gather a lot of that data passively really starts to make this a reality, and makes it viable in terms of the amount of time that you're going to spend generating this incremental value. You know, obviously we would take that data and generate the most high quality carbon offsets through this aggregation and verification process to get them serialized. So actually turn that data into a tangible product that can be sold for incremental value for your operation. You know, third is, you know, create the best opportunity. Our goal is to create a differentiated, high quality carbon offset for the agricultural market and bring enough volume that you can attract some of these companies that have made significant ESG commitments in the marketplace, and really garner the highest value for those offsets that we can. And finally, we want to return that financial value to your operation for being part of the climate change solution through leveraging the Farm Command platform and driving incremental multiple sources of value through the platform. And we think that the carbon offset market, the low carbon grain market, eventually water quality, water use efficiency will become part of this story as well. We think that there's opportunities around traceability. Once you've characterized the grain or the product that's coming off of the farm, and you can track that product to the end buyer with a low carbon footprint, there's significant opportunity from a farm operation perspective. You know, the special offer is, you know, we'd like to offer a no obligation carbon assessment and a free trial of our integrated data solution to your farm. We'd like to offer smart or smart VR on your farm, depending on what fits your operations, for a 1-year trial, along with a carbon assessment that really helps you understand what you may qualify for in terms of carbon offsets, what potential changes could drive even additional incremental value from an agronomic and sustainability perspective, and finally really help start to organize this data so that you're prepared as this carbon market continues to rapidly evolve. So you can book a meeting and get started by emailing carbon@farmersedge.ca, and one of our team members will respond to you and really schedule this assessment, walk you through the platform in more detail, share what some of the features, advantages, and benefits of the platform are, and answer additional questions that you have around carbon.